Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me, Dorothea, on Through an Orthodox Christian Lens. It is December 14th, 2025. I've been spending a lot of time looking up info on some historical context of the Russian czars, that era, and I'm going to be talking about just war and holy war theories. So I'm going to start with this article that brought me to this place of checking and researching. Okay, so this was back in February. Russian Patriarch mocks priest for questioning church's patriotism. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church publicly ridiculed a priest for criticizing the church's alignment with the Kremlin's wartime patriotic agenda, according to a leaked video recording. Patriarch Kirill, a close ally of President Vladimir Putin, has been a vocal supporter of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, and the country's Orthodox Church played a central symbolic role in rallying public support for the war. I don't agree with such a patriotic trend in church relations, a priest told Kirill at a clergy meeting on Tuesday. A priest's duty is to lead people to the kingdom of heaven and not to engage in patriotism. Kirill shot back by asking the priest, "Are you, Father, from Western Ukraine by any chance?" Following laughter and applause from the meeting hall, the church leader told the priest to go sit down and think seriously about all that you just blurted out here. Well, I decided to look into this. People have been saying, "Have you been looking into Patriarch Kirill and what he's been doing?" I basically knew somewhat about this, but I did not know details. I only knew that he was supporting this this tragedy that's going on. I do agree with the priest that it's a priest's duty to lead people to the kingdom of heaven and not to engage in patriotism. I would expect this from a political leader. I would expect this of supporting this war. I expect that from a political leader or president, but not the leader of a church. So I thought to myself, okay, what's going on here? I don't agree with what the patriarch said, even though I understand the dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics of what's going on and has been going on the past 30 to 40 years, well, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. I do know that the West has been trying to gain dominance, hegemony throughout the world. That was their chance, supposedly, and there are documents on this, that they've been planning this for ages. They've been talking about it. They've been planning it for ages. There's intel documents that are declassified on this, that they were working to grow NATO, as we know, and encroaching on Russia's borders. This has been going on for 30 years or so. So I'm aware of all that. I'm aware that Russia warned about that and the worries they had regarding this. I mean, it wasn't good. I mean, I think also that when I looked up and researched Tsarist Russia, there was no real separation between the president and the state and the Orthodox Church. That's how they work together. the Tsar worked together with the Synod, the Holy Synod of the Orthodox Church, in making a lot of the decisions in the society at the time. And there was an instance when they wanted Saint Philaret of Moscow. They wanted him to go, what's the word? Anoint or whatever. I forget what it's called now. Just ran from my mind. A new monument that they had up there, a triumphal arch, it was called, from winning against the Napoleon and his army. And Saint Philaret said, "I can't bless this because there was a pagan statue, I think, of the pagan, I think, well, it's a Greek pagan, Nike, or however they say it in Nike in Greek." And he says, "Sorry, I can't bless that because it's a pagan statue." So what I've noticed is that it's good when you have the saints that are within the church that are able to add their spiritual counsel to the Tsar to help in discussions and things of the nature of the society. I do think that's a good thing. But, this was more like monarchy type. So they didn't really have separation of church and state. So I feel like, as we know, modern Russia has kind of gone back to the Tsarist, or at least tries to go back to the Tsarist time of Russia. So I'm not surprised by the closeness between the church and the president. But I'm a little uncomfortable with, enthusiasm of supporting a war that's killed millions of people, of countrymen, especially in Ukraine. All Slavic Orthodox, they're all Orthodox basically. And I feel like the enemy, the evil one, has had a field day with the destruction of so many lives on both sides. I think that there could have been a better way to go about this. I don't think this was the right way. I think, although they tried, I just don't think this was, this really, for me, it felt like it really wasn't about or between Russia and Ukraine. This really is between Russia and the West. And I really wish that the Russians would have focused just on that. I don't know if they really had that much control over, obviously, us using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder, which is terrible. And, there's corruption in every government. There's, as we know. But as many of the saints say, Metropolitan Theophilus talks about this, that the worst, biggest price to pay will be us, the United States, because we have constantly done these kind of things, drummed up wars and things like that. But in any case, can't say I agree with what's he's saying there, Kirill's saying there. I think it's terrible what's happened with all the losses in this tragic war. I understand the geopolitics of it, and that a lot of it is to blame on my government and other Western governments. And but it's not like it's only one way. So I'm going to go on to this idea that I've heard Patriarch Kirill say of holy war, and give you the information on that. I'm going to go straight to Christ's teachings because this is a very long two-part article from 2019 by a priest. But I think it's important that I share this so people understand because I learned a lot from it. Christ's teachings. We know that Muhammad led an army. We know that Jesus did no such thing. When Peter took to violence, Christ told him to put his sword away, saying, "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Matthew 26:52. Jesus taught, "You have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your neighbors, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." Matthew 5:38-39, 43-44. Whatever one may think of these teachings and how to apply them, they are very clear. An extraordinary misleading column in the New York Times back in January 2003, just before the Second Iraq War, was titled, quote, "The Prince of Peace was a warrior too," end quote. It's still online if you want to check it out. Yes, Jesus did make war, but on Satan, not on people. Yes, Jesus said he came to bring not peace but a sword, but it was clear he was speaking only of the divisions he would cause within families and societies between those who believed in him and those who did not. Yes, Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, but his concern was with the defilement of worship. But no, in military wars, Jesus was not a warrior. The people of his generation turned against him precisely because he did not turn out the Roman oppressor, because he who had all power chose to be a non-combatant. No, in the wars between nations and people, Jesus was not a warrior. This is the early church. It appears the earliest Christians followed their Lord in this. So far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no evidence in the New Testament or from any 1st or 2nd century source of Christians serving in the military. Justin Martyr wrote that Christians, quote, "who formerly killed one another, refused to make war on their enemies," end quote. Origen wrote that Christians, quote, "no longer take up the sword against any nation, nor do we learn the art of war anymore. Instead, we have become sons of peace through Jesus, our founder." And everybody knows Origen eventually taught a heretical teaching, but he had good teachings as well. So he's talking about the good thing he said. There are other similar references. This, of course, was a fairly easy stand to take when the empire was pagan. There was no military draft, and the church was small and usually uninvolved in worldly affairs. Was the early church pacifist or principle? Some scholars say yes. However, I think the evidence, judging by the church calendar, is that it was not or at least not for long. For the church honors many 3rd and 4th century military men as saints, not because of their military activity, certainly, but rather because they were martyred for refusing to deny Christ. This is a key point here, I think. But the point is that, on principle, they saw no conflict between serving in the military, even serving a pagan empire, and being a Christian, nor did the early church disown them for being in the military. Later, after the conversion of Emperor Constantine, it became common for Christians to serve in the armed forces, defending the Christian empire. As time went on, Eastern and Western Christians began to diverge on the subject of war. So there's the Western just war theory. For comparison's sake, let's first take a westward excursion. We'll spend the rest of this column on this. In the West, in the 5th century, St. Augustine began to teach what came to be called the just war theory. This held that under certain conditions, war may be a just and good thing, that some wars are ordained by God. Soon, a kind of Christian cult of the glory of war began to develop in the West. There was a reason for this. Remember, the West at that time was being overrun by barbarians from the North. Augustine had seen the fall of the city of Rome. Westerners wanted to know, was it morally right for Christians to defend themselves and their society? The Western Church also wanted to try to apply some standards to war other than the contemporary one. Might makes right. Thus, the just war theory. Let's be clear, the just war theory is not Orthodox teaching. Orthodoxy takes a very different approach to the issue, which we'll come to next week. But the just war theory is the source of modern international law. Today, people on all sides, both religious and secular, debate and explain themselves using the standards of for the just war, often unknowingly. I have found it helpful for myself as a way to analyze and evaluate particular wars. The basic points of the just war theory have varied quite a lot, but generally it includes these requirements. 1. The war must be authorized by proper authority. 2. The war must be defensive, in defense of territory or of established human rights. Wars of aggression are unjust. 3. Every effort must be made to avoid civilian casualties on grounds of the dignity of all human life from conception to the grave. Our enemies are human beings created in the image of God, for whom Christ died, people's children and grandchildren and husbands and wives. 4. There must be a reasonable hope of success in the war. It must not be fought to no purpose, or simply to assuage pride or anger or to save face. This would apply, for example, to the latter years of the Vietnam War when, as it turns out, our government knew it could not be won. But, well, let's not go there. Now, 5. War must be the last resort. All other options must be excluded first. There are sometimes a number of other requirements. But how to apply the principles of the just war? This gets tricky. Consider point 1. What is proper authority? Once it was clear, the emperor or the pope. Most Western moral theologians today say this means each nation's laws should be followed. However, the Constitution of the United States requires a formal declaration of war by Congress, and no American war since 1941 has been formally declared. So are they all to be considered unjust? Do members of the United Nations need specific UN authorization, or do they not? Who decides these things? The just war theory does not say. Point 2. What is defensive war? What is aggression? This is even more confusing, and even when clear, has been applied very erratically. In World War II, when Germany and Japan attacked other countries, we rightly called it aggression. However, in previous centuries, when Western European nations built their empires by military invasion, we called it not aggression, but, quote, the white man's burden, end quote, or something to that effect. When Anglo-Americans drove Native Americans off their lands and confined them to reservations, we described it not as unjust aggression, but as, quote unquote, manifest destiny. Again, when in 1947 the United Nations, led by the United States and Great Britain, established Israel, driving Palestinians from their ancestral homes and lands, the Western powers did not call that unjust. However, when Palestinians and their allies tried to defend and recover their land, that was considered unjust by the West. Take a current issue, preventive, quote-unquote, war. By the traditional just war standard, the United States attack on Iraq in 2003 would probably be considered unjust aggression, since Iraq had not attacked us. However, since modern attacks can be launched and completed within a matter of minutes, some Western moral theologians now argue that a preemptive attack to head off imminent attack by an enemy is justified. But this is a two-edged sword. As we prepared to make a preemptive attack on Iraq, why then would it not have been just for Iraq to launch a preemptive attack on us? Can we see a contemporary application here? As it turned out, Iraq never had the intention or ability to pull off an attack on us. It was all a mistake. Furthermore, if many nations should choose to launch preemptive wars against potential enemies, what would keep the world from quickly being thrown back into barbarism? So where does this leave us? Or take point 3. It was easier to avoid civilian casualties in earlier times when many, though certainly not all, wars were fought on battlefields outside cities. Beginning with World War II, the great powers generally abandoned this principle. Civilians were intentionally attacked, beginning with Hitler's Blitzkrieg of England and other countries, followed by Allied saturation bombing of German cities and American nuclear bombing of Japanese cities. In the Vietnam War, American bombing killed between 500,000 and 1 million non-military civilians. With modern quote-unquote precision bombing, and now bombing by drones, we in the West, though certainly not those conducting the Syrian war, had tried to recover the principle of avoiding civilian casualties, but with only limited success because of the immense power and imprecision of our weaponry. Can the requirement of avoiding civilian casualties be fulfilled in any modern war? So the results of the just war theory, they've been mixed. It has allowed Christians to defend their homelands without guilt. If America had not gotten involved in World War II, we might all now be living under the Nazi thousand-year Reich. It has given Christians a way to evaluate wars and their intentions instead of just charging into them full speed ahead, and to learn from wars instead of just being winners or losers. I think the biggest problem with the theory is that it does not take into account the possible unexpected consequences of war. What so-called just wars intend and what they accomplish are often two very different things. The Crusades, for example, were authorized according to the just war theory. These were to be the good war, properly approved by the Pope to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim aggressors. But in fact, the Crusades did immense unintended harm. Crusaders ravaged soldiers and civilians, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. Well, none of them looked like Europeans, did they? Christians were still the majority in Jerusalem before the Crusaders liberated it, but never since then. Crusaders sacked and occupied Constantinople, setting up a Latin emperor and patriarchate. The Byzantine Empire was recovered but greatly weakened. This was the chief cause of its being conquered by the Turks. In this context, I think something should be said about the Iraq wars. The wars themselves were relatively quote-unquote clean, but by reputable estimates, their unintended aftermath resulted in from 150 to over 450,000 deaths, most of them civilians. I think it's even higher than that. You can see that the Western just war theory, though helpful to our thinking in many ways, is also a can of worms. Now let's go to the Orthodox side of this. Okay. So, Father Stanley Harakis, he used to be a professor at the Holy Cross School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts. He wrote in his study on this subject, he began with the assumption that the Orthodox Church had a just war theory of our own, I suppose because everybody else seemed to assume it. But over the years, he discovered that the East Church had taken a very different tack. In light of the patristic, this is quote, in light of the patristic evidence, my conclusion was and still is, the East did not seek to answer questions concerning the correct conditions for entering war and the correct conduct of war on the basis of the possibility of a just war, quote unquote, precisely because it did not hold to such a view. Its view of war, unlike that of the West, was that it is a necessary evil. The peace ideal continued to remain normative, and no theoretical efforts were made to make conduct of war into a positive norm. In short, no case can be made for the existence of an Orthodox just war theory, he says. Now, you can find a couple of Orthodox commentators who disagree with this. I heard one of them on a call-in program on Wisconsin Public Radio soon before the 2003 Iraq War, arguing that in the Orthodox view, this would be a just war, quote-unquote. I don't see why. I called in to say I didn't think so, and that Orthodox metropolitans and bishops all over the world were begging us not to do this, except, oddly enough, those in the United States. Apparently, there are no facts to support an Eastern Orthodox theory of the just war. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said there can be opinions about facts or lack thereof, but there can be only one set of facts. Things are either true or untrue. I wish those who lately believe alternative facts, quote unquote, would figure this out, but that's another story. Or maybe it isn't. If we might someday again be fed, quote unquote, alternative facts about war. Well, since then, that's definitely happened. So why don't we have this just war in Orthodoxy? Perhaps it's because during our formative patristic period in the East, war rarely affected most people. War was almost always on the fringes of the empire, and hired mercenaries took care of it. Also in the East, Orthodox emperors dealt with such matters. We didn't have to face the same issues as in the West, where enemies were attacking the Christian imperial world, which was collapsing. Things changed later in the East, of course, but by then, Orthodox principles were established. Or perhaps it was because the Eastern Fathers started with and stuck with the teachings of Christ and the apostles. St. Augustine of Hippo, who apparently originated the just war theory, was a good and holy man, but in the Orthodox view, he also imposed a number of other unfortunate interpretations on the tradition of the church. So what did the church teach about war? The Orthodox fathers held that war is always an evil, that there was no such thing as a just war, a holy war. Though it was usually held that wars could sometimes be the lesser of evils, the church never taught that war could be good or glorious. Killing in war required repentance. Different fathers took somewhat different approaches to this subject. Here is an inadequate sample. In the 2nd century, Hippolytus of Rome, he was Western, writing before the empire became Christian, was strict. Quote, a Christian must not become a soldier unless he is compelled by a chief bearing the sword. He is not to burden himself with the sin of blood. But if he has shed blood, he is not to partake of the mysteries unless he is purified by a punishment, tears, and wailing. He is not to come forward deceitfully, but in the fear of God. That was number 14 of his canonical epistles. St. Basil the Great, writing after the establishment of the Orthodox Empire, was less strict. Quote, our fathers did not consider killings committed in the course of wars to be classifiable as murders at all on the score, it seems to me, of allowing a pardon to men fighting in defense of sobriety and piety. Perhaps, though, it might be advisable to refuse them communion for 3 years on the ground that their hands are not clean. Number 13 of his 92 canonical epistles. St. Athanasius the Great is sometimes quoted in favor of war, since he wrote in one place that, quote, we, quote unquote, glorify those who have fought in war, but in context he seems to be referring to society as we, not saying that the church does so. Quote, as late as the 10th century, when the empire was hard pressed by enemies, the emperor Nicephorus II Phocas suggested that men who died in battle against the Muslims should be considered as martyrs. The church refused. While Orthodox laymen could serve in the military, to this day, the church continues its original ideal of non-violence in the clergy. By canon law, clergy have always been forbidden to serve in the military. And a side note, which is why it's disgraceful and horrible and shameful that there being the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox clergy is being drafted into this terrible war. In fact, in the Byzantine Empire, clergy were not even allowed to enter military camps, though today Orthodox clergy can at least serve as military chaplains. Well, I guess that doesn't forbid monks from carrying guns. Below is the abbot of Prevale, we can't see the picture, but monastery on Crete during World War II. Note carefully, which hid refugees from the Nazis, then by night led them far below. It's a scary descent, and shipped them off to safety in Egypt. Yes, I saw that in Greece. I understand that Orthodox canon law also says that anyone who has killed, even unintentionally, may not be ordained. I can't locate the law. Can someone find it for us? As with many of our canon laws, some are considered to be still binding, while others are not. And nobody tells us which are which, but I know I have sat with an Orthodox bishop as he interviewed a man seeking ordination. The first question the bishop asked was, have you ever killed anyone? The Orthodox clergy are to be signs of God's peace. Sir Steve Russellman's comparison of East and West. So he's a 20th century British historian who's not Orthodox, though he had an affection for Orthodoxy. And he wrote about the Byzantine Empire. This is from his History of the Crusades, Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 1. So I'm going to read his quotes. The Christian citizen has a fundamental problem to face. Is he entitled to fight for his country? His religion is a religion of peace, and war means slaughter and destruction. The earlier Christian fathers had no doubts. To them, a war was wholesale murder. But after the triumph of the cross, after the empire had become Christendom, ought not its citizens to be ready to take up arms for its welfare? The Eastern Church thought not. Its great canonist St. Basil, while he realized that the soldier must obey orders, yet maintained that anyone guilty of killing in war should refrain for 3 years from taking communion as a sign of repentance. This counsel was too strict. The Byzantine soldier was not in fact treated as a murderer, but his profession brought him no glamour. Death in battle was not considered glorious, nor was death in battle against the infidel considered martyrdom. The martyr died armed only with his faith. To fight against the infidel was deplorable, though it might at times be unavoidable. To fight against fellow Christians was doubly bad. Indeed, Byzantine history was remarkably free of wars of aggression. Justinian's campaigns had been undertaken to liberate Romans from heretic barbarian governors, Basil II's against the Bulgars, to recover imperial provinces, and to remove a danger that menaced Constantinople. Peaceful methods were always preferable, even if they involved torturous diplomacy or the payment of money. To Western historians accustomed to admire martial valor, the actions of many Byzantine statesmen appear cowardly or sly, but the motive was usually a genuine desire to avoid bloodshed. The Princess Anna Komnena, one of the most typical of Byzantines, makes it clear in her history that, deep as was her interest in military questions and what much as she appreciated her father's success in battle, she considered war a shameful thing, a last resort when all else had failed, indeed, in itself a confession of failure. The Western point of view was less enlightened. St. Augustine himself had admitted that wars might be waged by the command of God, and the military society that had emerged in the West out of the barbarian invasions inevitably sought to justify this habitual pastime. The code of chivalry that was developed, supported by popular epics, gave prestige to the military hero, and the pacifist acquired a disrepute from which he has never recovered. Against this sentiment the Church could do little, and it sought rather to direct bellicose energy into paths that would lead to its own advantage. The holy war, that is to say, war in the interests of the Church, became permissible, even desirable. Pope Leo IV, in the mid-9th century, declared that anyone dying in battle for the defense of the Church would receive a heavenly reward. Pope John VIII, a few years later, ranked the victims of a holy war as martyrs. If they died armed in battle, their sins would be remitted. Anna Komnena was to note with horror that while her church tried honestly to avoid warfare on holy days, the Western Knights attacked Constantinople during Holy Week, while their armies were full of armed and fighting priests. But I think we should add that when wars were necessary, Byzantine troops marched toward battle, singing in the same militant chant we use yet today. O Lord, save thy people and bless thy inheritance, granting to thy people victory over all their enemies. And to you, our champion and leader, we, your servants, offer thanks for victory, O Theotokos. No doubt the hymns originally referred to victory over Satan and our spiritual enemies, but that's how he ends it. So, lots of information here. I wanted to share it with you. I'm sorry it's long, but I thought it was important to share what this all meant. We need to know and be educated on what all this means, and perhaps some of you already knew this, but I think it's important for us to talk about this and to realize that we don't have a just war theory or a holy war law, canon, theory. And it's kind of murky somewhat now, apparently, because of all that has happened. But you could say overall that we are not for these wars. I think they did talk about for defense, but there was a lot of murkiness in there and how that came about and how it's looked at and how it's used, to advantage and all this. So, there is no holy war. So I don't think Kirill is right on this. I do think that people should be able to defend their homeland themselves, because even those that we are fighting against in defense are made in the image of Christ. We have to remember, so are we. And we have to protect our own lives as well. And then those who are in danger, that of course I have heard that our church has always been okay with, is for us to try to defend those who are vulnerable and are not able to protect themselves. So the United States really violate even all the reasons that we would do that the Western's just war theory would be. I don't think there is any that we have done since World War II that has been anything close to what they're saying there. Lots of information there. I hope you got something out of that. I mean, share your thoughts on this. I understand the terrible conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I've spoken on it several times. And then of course the West's involvement and all that. But then when you look at all that's happened and the result, all the wasted lives in both countries, but especially in Ukraine. So tell me what you think. Tell me what your thoughts are on this. Thanks so much for watching, for following my channel. If you haven't subscribed, think about it, consider it, and thanks for your support.